Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on disinformation, digital resilience, and COVID-19. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this very interesting webinar where we want to share valuable insights on the key drivers of disinformation and also on the main measures that we could take in order to tackle this widespread phenomena. Today, we are going to approach a very sensitive and important topic at the same time that emanates from the very nature of the cyberspace that has become our second nature. And more specifically, we are referring to the hyper-connected nature of cyberspace that works as a force multiplier, allowing external entities to plant, disseminate, and lend credibility to disinformation. We know very well, based on various studies that have flourished in the past, in recent years, that disinformation should be seen and treated as a serious threat to societal stability for a number of reasons, and I'm just going to enumerate 3 of them. Disinformation campaigns are designed to provoke public discontent and create an aura of distrust in societies everywhere the world. European publics already divided on key topics such as migration, Brexit, the COVID pandemic. Such offensives have led to heightened polarization over the issue. And let's not forget that hybrid interference does not adopt a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather exploits specific vulnerabilities depending on target country context. This is the so-called wedged strategy. Well, in this context, we want to open the floor for a fruitful debate on the main challenges that could be tackled in the context of growing disinformation. And I am not alone, of course, in this endeavor. We have 3 very dear guests. And the first guest that I'm going to invite to share his valuable insights and his experience at the same time on the measures and on what works when we are dealing with growing disinformation is Ryan Markley. Ryan, if I may. Ryan is Managing Director of Aspen Digital, and he's also the coordinator of a very interesting study on information disorder that was issued by Aspen Institute in November 2021. So it is very recent. Ryan, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to hearing your ideas on how to deal with this widespread phenomena.
Well, thanks so much, and good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada, where is my home. Thanks for kind of setting up the question. I think this is an enormous whole of society problem. And while so much of the discussion often centers on the bad behavior of state actors or of cable news or of the large technology companies, and all of them are rightly to blame for many parts of this problem, I think one of the things that we observed in the work of the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder was that this is a problem that reaches across all aspects of society, and that the solutions will also have to come from across all aspects of society, which is not to say that any of those originally sort of selected groups that I mentioned are off the hook, but is just to say that all of us have a role in the solutions. You mentioned the commission, so I'll spend just a moment speaking about it. The commission was a 6-month investigation focused mostly on the U.S. From the Aspen Institute based in the U.S., where it looked at what it calls information disorder. We often use the terms misinformation and disinformation, and information disorder is designed to sort of step up one level and think about disinformation, the sort of malicious, intentional spreading of false information for a sort of nefarious or malicious purpose, and misinformation, the sometimes unintentional spreading of that kind of information. But also to look at the broader information ecosystem that creates the conditions for these things to take place. And I think you alluded to this in your opening remarks. Disinformation doesn't create discord from scratch. You mentioned the wedge, and I think that's a really, really important insight, and one that the Commission talked about a lot, which is that it builds on things that people already believe, often wrongly so. But Brexit's a great example. It didn't manufacture the sort of underlying themes of racism that were that sat below the surface and sometimes right in the foreground during those debates. It amplified beliefs that were already held within society, wrongly held, but held nonetheless. And it validated them, it foregrounded them, and then it created space for them to spread. And so the Commission offered a set of recommendations, which I won't go through, but it also offered a set of key insights that I think are really foundational. And some of them we've sort of already talked about. And the one that I've begun with already is that disinformation is a symptom of a larger problem, which is one of structural inequities and weaknesses in society. And I think any solution that means to reduce the worst harms of disinformation in our society and to minimize that discord will have to start there. That even if we spend all of our time talking about algorithms and technology companies and the advertising platforms, all of which are contributory factors, significant contributory factors, we will still be left with methods of disinformation that will exist because these underlying things that are broken in our society remain. And so addressing those is really important. The sort of corollary to that is the idea that disinformation does not just deceive people, which it does, but it also provides permission for them to continue to believe or to more deeply believe things that they may already think or that they may already believe that may be wrongly informed by biases, by historical racism, by inequities, or by their own fears about things that are happening in the economy, in their society, and in their communities. And I think another important element of this is the sort of decline of the information ecosystem that we rely upon. And I'll make that my last point, which is the communities around the world need to be able to get good information, and these systems rely on us being able to have places we can go where we trust what we hear, whether it's trusting what we hear from our government leaders or whether it's from our news outlets. And certainly in the US, and as I said, the report focused its attention there, but the issue is not only in the US, local news has declined dramatically. And we know from research that people are more likely to trust news that they get from their local communities, from reporters who work and live in their communities. And as those decline, because the business models have been so shattered, the ability for good local news to be created and then disseminated means people have to rely on other sources. And often those sources are large national cable news outlets that are much less accountable or that are more prone to certain kinds of political leanings. So things become more polarized and less rooted in the kind of community norms and connections that we count on in order to know who to trust. So maybe I'll stop there, and I really look forward to the discussion, and thank you again for inviting me to be part of it.
Thank you very much for these introductory insights. To be honest, I was extremely pleased to read in your report a very realistic, let's say, answer to the way we should approach this information. And this refers to the fact that we could not possibly mitigate all effects of disinformation. So this is basically impossible. What we should do would be to focus on the main vulnerabilities, on the main weaknesses, and let's say on the most disadvantaged targets, publics in this story of disinformation or misinformation, and try to support them to navigate through all these challenges and even dangers. And speaking about dangers in the context of the COVID pandemic, it has become more and more clear that disinformation could hurt. I mean, disinformation could really have extremely negative effects, life-threatening effects. So we are talking here about life-threatening effects. And I was reading a very interesting report issued by the Vaccine Hesitancy Project. That is a project of MIT Sloan. And they found that over 70% of people that refused to get an anti-COVID vaccine were very familiar with at least one myth or one fake story related to vaccination and to the COVID virus as such. How would you comment this aspect related to the very the greatest the most harmful effects of disinformation? What should be done in a whole of society approach, as you mentioned?
I think this insight that we can't eliminate all misinformation is a challenging one, because it means having to accept an information environment that will contain false facts, and that we have to work in that dynamic. And we kind of always had to, and so that's not new. And so even the concept of disinformation, I think it's important to note, is not new. Just calling it disinformation is perhaps the new piece. Sometimes, at one point we would have called it propaganda, and in many cases perhaps we still should. And so I think the key piece here is that people are making decisions about their lives based on what they hear and what they learn. In my previous work, I was chief of staff at Wikipedia, and one of the things I worked on was our defense and response against disinformation. And so working with the foundation, which supports the broad community that builds and writes Wikipedia every day, and thinking about disinformation. And one of the things that was happening at the time that I was there was the emergence of the COVID pandemic. And one of the things I think that community knows is that at any moment, the truth is, or the facts are the best version of what we can assemble together in that moment. And so in order to help people, we have to create an environment where we are honest with them about what we know and what we think we know, and present that to them in a way that they know that they are receiving information that is meant to help them, and also that we don't always know everything. And that there will be, especially in something like a pandemic, a dynamic where we use empirical evidence and science and research to make assessments and give people advice, and know that that advice may change over time, because we will learn things, and that is the nature of science. And we've gotten into this environment where having to change your advice or change information is seen as sort of a gotcha or an undermining force. That the fact that we didn't know if you should wear masks at the beginning of the pandemic, and now we know that you absolutely should wear masks, and probably should wear high quality K95 masks, not cloth masks, is seen as some kind of massive failing or a lie or a conspiracy, when the truth is the pandemic emerged, we had no idea, and the science told us some things, and then later the science told us other things. And that's normal. And so the truth or the facts that we have is always based on the best evidence, and helping people to understand how that works, and giving people honest assessments about what we know and how we know it allows them to be less shaken when those facts are updated and revised, which is, for what it's worth, how science is supposed to work. But we've gotten into this place where it is used as a way of undermining what people hear and learn. And in a pandemic, that can be deadly. And we've definitely seen
that. For sure. And speaking about evidence-informed decisions, I would switch or pass the floor to Clara Volunteiro. Clara has done a very, very interesting research and has collected very recent data on, let's say, that could help us, that could guide us in these endeavors to better understand why people tend to trust disinformation, misinformation, fake news, and what should be done in this regard. Because if we don't understand all these complex aspects, then it is very difficult for us to implement the right approach. So Clara, the floor is yours.
There it is. Hello, everyone on the panel and everyone who's watching us. I am very, very happy to be part of this conversation. I know my colleagues, Loredana and Flavia. I've known them for years, and Ryan, it's been such a pleasure to hear you as well earlier. And because you mentioned the local communities, I have to mention that our data collection effort for this discussion and this project is also linked to another project, which is called Local Resilience Index. And we're trying to pilot a methodology where we can assess, in partnership with the Aspen Institute Romania, where we can assess the extent to which different factors contribute and represent the intrinsic dimensions of local societal resilience. In Romania and Moldova, we're piloting it in this area of the globe. Now, the idea with this information is that it is a major cause for societal resilience or lack of thereof, if we want to frame it as such. So with just a couple of slides, I would like to showcase some of our findings. I've just managed to compile the data right before our meeting, because it's very, very freshly gathered from Romanian, again, at local level. We have a representative sample at local level from Romanian communities. And what came up very quickly is this 3D threat matrix that I've called 3D threat matrix, because we were looking at elements of disinformation and their cause and effect in our local communities. But very quickly, it turned up that this is linked to what I would call dilettantism, or the fact that we all think ourselves as knowledgeable enough. So there is this issue of not being, there was this book a couple of years ago by Tom Nichols, which was called The Death of Expertise. And I think you need to be quite realistic with regards to what you know and what you don't know. And if we talk about the COVID pandemics right now, I think it's astonishing how many of us have quickly become epidemiologists overnight. And with the French president having, publicly claimed that he has enough knowledge to ascertain epidemiologic advices, I think we're not in the proper place to distinguish between who are the people who should be giving advice and who are the people who are supposed to be trusting those pieces of information. So if you look at the right side corner of our graph, you see that in terms of ensuring the quality of information, our respondents have allocated the largest value to the fact that they relied on their own knowledge. And that's why I was mentioning this self-sufficiency with regards to fact-checking and the quality of information. If information was triangulated and checked, it was done so through multiple sources online. So there's still this type of activity in the online environment, digital environment. And then the other point, which is worth mentioning, is what Ryan already mentioned, and Loredana as well, which is distrust. And of course, distrust can be framed as a cause of disinformation and misinformation, but it's also a vector of it. So the more distrust you have in society, the more permeability you will end up with regards to disinformation and other sources of malicious information distribution. And, trusting your sources of information, I think, should be correlated with trust in public authorities or other vectors of authority at national level. We haven't done that yet. But overall, if you look on the left side corner of this slide, you will see that overall in Romania, there is a very low trust towards any sort of information sources, which I find quite worrying myself, because even if the largest trust is allocated to the proper channels like official statistics, professional websites, here we are talking, like governmental websites or WHO portals, there is still a very relatively low level of trust even in these ones, talking about the fact of the catch you moment, and if you didn't know it from the very beginning, then there's something wrong with you in terms of authorities' advice with regards to how we should handle ourselves. And of course the information from family and friends is equally trusted, but this creates bubbles. And this is the real life equivalent of echo chambers that we're talking about within social networks and social media. So I think we should be trusting each other, but we should be very careful about the fact that we all together might not know the right answer to how we should manage the collective threats we are facing. Now, in terms of, just a second. In terms of the narratives that, again, you know, what Ryan mentioned, I think is very important everywhere across the globe. The fact that this information doesn't come from nowhere. We have to be very mindful of the fact that certain sensibilities exist, certain suspicions prevail in our societies, different suspicions prevail in our societies. So we wanted to check to what extent certain narratives that are extracted from the disinformation playbook that my colleagues at Eurocomunicare have very carefully assembled from public discourse. And we tested those narratives against our sample of respondents. And economic inferiority was the one that had the highest permeability. If you look at the right side of my bars, the fact that Romania is exploited by the EU, that it was accepted in the EU only as a market for opening and selling their products from the Western companies, and other rhetorics of exploitation and asymmetry between Western powers and Eastern member states, is the most it creates the highest permeability in terms of disinformation in Romania. The second largest being that the Romanian identity is under threat. Now, interestingly enough, the other ones are not as powerful as you might think. Despite very low vaccinations rate, there weren't that many people supporting, or not the majority of people supporting, the idea that it was instrumentally created. Nevertheless, quite 60% of our respondents thought that COVID is a biological weapon, and vaccinating kids is immoral, and that pharmaceutical companies are hiding information. So this is not a comfortable situation, but it's not the most severe issue in terms of narratives in Romania. Interestingly enough, the majority of our respondents had, in our Czech narrative assessment, had a big support, the largest support for the mainstream argument that vaccines are an effective treatment. So there is this kind of self-balancing act. And I will stop only with this axis. I will stop at this axis. So this is my final point, and then I'm happy to discuss the fact that we hypothesized in this research that your values can create a higher or lower permeability of this information. And because left-right value orientation in terms of political preference is no longer so accurate, at least not in the European societies, we try to assess conservative versus progressive values. And you see that the Romanian society seems to be much more skewed towards the conservative values, at least from our sample of respondents. But interestingly enough, in terms of progressive values, which are lower on the scale, protecting the rights of minorities is not that low. So this is something that we should be probably investigating further, but it seems to be, it is on par with religion, and Romania is quite a religious country. So this idea of civil liberties for minority groups is important in terms of the balancing of values in the Romanian society. I will stop there, and obviously I'm happy to answer any questions or add on any points you think fit.
Thank you so much, Kara, for sharing this very, very recent, very fresh data with us. But till the end of the day, in democratic societies, it is very difficult to set up a minister of truth, because we keep discussing about disinformation, misinformation, fake news, propaganda, manipulation, so on and so forth. All these, let's call them communication pathologies, but it is very difficult to set up some very objective criteria in order to differentiate between facts and, let's say, or objective truths and what could be labeled as misinformation, disinformation, or half-truths. I know that Flavia Durac, my colleague from Eurocomunicare, has been involved in very interesting projects and research on this very topic. So she has been striving to determine what are the key elements, the main indicators, if you want, that we could use in order to differentiate between what is fake and what could be regarded as an objective information, piece of information. So, Flavia, what could you tell us? Please share with us your findings, and afterwards we'll go back to Clara's research.
Thank you, Loredana. Hello, everyone. I thought of addressing the question of the audience's vulnerability to disinformation and how to assess the level of resilience within a society. And our vulnerability, or our vulnerability as citizens, as members of a society, comes from two directions. First, it comes from our capacity to distinguish between fake and true, between genuine and not genuine, counterfeit arguments, if you wish, to be able to exert our critical thinking capacities. And this relates to fake news as a veracity fraud, as a fraud with truth, or the notion of objective truth. But there is another side that the other speakers also tackle directly or indirectly, the issue of fake news or online disinformation as an engagement fraud, meaning that disinformation is amplified both with technical and human means in a way that increases our exposure and thus our vulnerability. And here's some of the research that I previously did or read about regarding the Romanian societies, that we have low levels of media literacy and we have bad information hygiene, especially in the online environment. We don't know what the correct behavior could be with respect to circulating disinformation, sharing the news, reading the news, finding the right sources, and so on. There are also other questions that are related to resilience. There are some conditions that work at macro level within a society and that can weaken the resilience of countries with respect to online disinformation. And these factors, which have been mapped in the literature, are on one hand the polarization of society, both ideological polarization and also affective polarization, the emotions that surround different topics. And polarization means that we have more than one version of the truth or of reality, and that in turn means that citizens are confronted with different and deviating representations of that reality. Another factor that contributes or affects resilience is the extent to which we are exposed to populist communication within a society. Because populism and partisan communication have some features that are related or connected, in the sense that they create two camps: we who are right and they who are wrong and fake. These type of divisions that lead to the notion of subjective truth also increase our vulnerability to different narratives of disinformation. There are also factors coming from the media environment that may limit resilience. On one hand, low trust in news, which is prevalent in countries where the media system is less robust. And also the level of hard news in a society, news that we can rely upon. And also the existence of fragmented audiences of news also leads to a fragmentation of points of view, of narratives, of types of interpretations that we are exposed to. Lastly, there are some factors that stem from the economic environment, which may also limit resilience. A large ad market size, because disinformation is highly lucrative from a financial point of view, and this means that a large ad market size provides the incentives for the monetization of disinformation, and high use of social media. If we tend to use social media as gateways for news and information, we become more exposed to toxic narratives that are potentially harmful. And I'm going to take only a few more minutes to discuss what to do about these issues. One key issue is that we have to focus on all the sides or the implications of the phenomenon. It is not sufficient to focus on content. It is not sufficient to focus on the audience. It is not sufficient to focus on the distribution. What we have to do is to tackle all these three battlefields at the same time, because the problem resides in the intersection of all these factors that are related to audience, to content, and to the distribution of that content. A second issue is the fact that the digital platforms act as private superpowers that have the power to shape the public discourse. They provide the public service in engaging in this type of public discourse. And we have this conflict and power asymmetry between the digital platforms, the media organizations and publishers, and the public authorities. And there are numerous recent initiatives that target the gatekeeping position of the digital platforms and are meant to curb their power by comparison to the power and influence of other stakeholders and, of course, the general public. And lastly, we have to improve the news and information ecosystem to make it more robust, to reduce the risk of platform-driven, big data-driven computational propaganda that is disguised as news and information. And there, at least in Romania, there are a number of websites and people that present themselves as journalists, but their only platform is through establishing an online presence that is based only on popularity and not the quality or the quality of content or the professional credentials that they have. So basically, we have to reduce the venues for computational propaganda to take place. We can discuss more in the discussion session, I guess. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Flavia. Now, by corroborating your insights with Clara's research and also with Ryan's report, I would open the discussion session by focusing on a very harmful effect of disinformation, and that is polarization. And I think that all of us have heard the stories about the parents not talking anymore with their kids, with their children, because of reasons related to the way they approach various events in the society, COVID included here, vaccination included here. And this is very painful because it is extremely disturbing in any society. It undetermines, let's say, the stability of societies as such. So my question for all of you, Clara, Flavia, Ryan, regards the very topic of polarization. Do you think that this is transversal and universal strategy employed by those that are carrying out these, let's call them disinformation campaigns, even though this might not be the very right wording, in order to seed distrust, in order to seed harmful feelings, and to build a lot of rage within our societies. So is this an universal strategy that is only targeted at topics, at vulnerabilities of various countries, groups, or subgroups, or communities?
Can I jump in first? I mean, maybe I will open the box too much, but as an economist, I have to say that the wedges in our society are primarily socioeconomic and structurally driven. So I think, as you already mentioned in terms of the wedge strategy and so on, and Ryan already gave the Brexit example, these socioeconomic inequalities that affect our societies in Europe and America have been building up for quite some time now. And I suspect disinformation is a strategy that comes on top of these existing vulnerabilities. Now, whether it enlarges them or not, I am on the fence. I mean, I would defer to Flavia or Ryan to present their vision on the extent to which disinformation enlarges existing divisions, or the extent to which our institutions have failed to bridge the existing divisions. And here I refer primarily to socioeconomic divisions, because those are the issues that can be addressed through good governance and evidence-based policy making. Now, what disinformation does in terms of exploiting these existent grievances and divisions in our society is to further lower the trust and implicitly the compliance of our citizens with regard to their authorities. So I think this is the channel that creates vulnerability in times of crisis. This is the channel that lowers vaccination rates, for example. This is the channel that creates, any kind of non-compliant behavior, even fiscal evasion, because you don't feel that your money is accurately managed by public authorities. So I think these are the elements that we should be looking at in this sequence, from structural grievances, socioeconomic grievances that hurt and fuel distrust in our society, and the way disinformation comes on top of that.
Flavia, Ryan, any thoughts on this?
If I may, I would say that disinformation is always meant to be divisive. That's one of the main elements that ensures its persuasive power, and also one of the elements that ensures its virality. However, I agree with Clara that the divisions are not necessarily created by disinformation. I think, but we need to back it up with more research data, of course, but I think that disinformation deepens pre-existing divisions in a society, because it tends to frame any relevant social or political issue, to frame them on the basis of the divisions that they want to emphasize, to highlight. And at some point, as Niall Ferguson said, we tend to have groups, social groups that interact with each other and construct a debate on some issues, but different sides that are on the extremes, not necessarily politically or ideology driven extremes, but at least extremes from the point of view of solutions, maybe, or measures that can be done to tackle something. And we have two sides that bark at each other, as Niall Ferguson said, over a largely vacated middle. This is what we lose under the influence of disinformation. We lose the capacity to meet in the middle and at least to agree on some fundamental aspects. For instance, one fundamental aspect would be that vaccines are a good health measure that has been proven in the last century multiple times. We have lost this mutual agreement on the efficacy of vaccines, and we can see the consequences today during the pandemic.
Maybe I'll pick up there. Yeah, thank you. And thanks to my colleagues for your presentations. Clara, the data in that survey is quite disturbing. And so thank you for collecting it and presenting it. Anyway, I appreciate a window into some of that work. I agree with all the statements my colleagues have shared here about the existing cracks in society and the social inequities. I think this is a really challenging space, and I think you sort of opened with that comment in that it is multifaceted. There is no one actor, and there is no one force at play. And so I think about Flavia's just previous comment about people's beliefs and the things that shape them. Those things come from your social inequities in your relationship with the state and what you believe about vaccines. They come from your peer groups and what they tell you and what they're discussing. They come from potentially disinformation campaigns and things that are meant to drive wedges. They may come from your past experience in a health system or something that is a legitimate negative experience that you may have had, whether it's backed by science or not, but it may be a real thing that preys upon a fear that sits inside you as for your own health or as a parent. And how we get good information and who we trust has been flattened out by the sort of rapid fire connected nature of social media. And I think we haven't talked a lot about social media and the big tech platforms in this particular discussion, though in other conversations I've been in, it has dominated the entire conversation. Okay. And I think both of those are legitimate. I think it is true that the platforms don't create that or don't author the original discord. It is also true that they are like gasoline poured on a fire in many ways. In not just in the way that the algorithms or the business models are skewed away from healthy discourse and towards division, but also in the way that social media culturally and socially creates a dynamic where every one of us is required to have, not required, but I don't have a better word for it, but let's say I'll use that anyway, is sort of invited or expected to have an opinion about everything. And that means that you get a very high volume of not particularly legitimate opinions. I have an opinion about the US government's decision to move out of Afghanistan and the way in which it's approached it, but I am not a diplomatic expert, nor do I know anything about military tactics. And yet, as somebody who, has followers on Twitter and talks to people about issues of public import, I find myself in this place where people expect you to have an opinion about the issues of the day everywhere, all the time, in real time. And so you get this dynamic where there's a sort of flattening out of the opinions of people who are qualified experts and the people who are just there also, who can be much louder. And that dynamic, I think, undermines some of what could be beneficial from the discourse, which is knowing who to trust and who has real intellectual weight and heft to bring to the discussion versus just loud opinions.
Thank you so much, all of you, for these answers and these ideas. I would go to another topic that, again, I think is very present in our lives, and this is related to the anti-science feelings. I found myself not once, but several times in a situation where I had to explain my grandparents, my parents, why to get vaccinated. This is very odd because my grandparents, at least, lived those times when they had polio, they had to fight tuberculosis, and all these got solved through vaccines. So the value and the benefits of vaccines should be or should have been very evident, very obvious for this category of publics, but still I faced a lot of resistance from their side regarding vaccination and also the way they should handle COVID as a disease, so on and so forth. So my question here refers to these anti-science feelings that seem to be very popular and harmful in our society. Do you consider it as a direct effect of disinformation, or was it there before disinformation campaigns started to flourish and to penetrate our, let's say, social life? How should we approach and how should we understand this anti-science stance of some categories of public?
Well, if we are to keep the order, it's also fit because both myself and you, Loredana, we're mothers, and I'm sure we both faced the movement of vaxxers in the mother community or parent community in Romania. So, and I am sure this happens in other countries and in America as well. So I definitely don't think this anti-science movement is part of the COVID, constellation of issues. I think it's something that definitely pre-existed COVID. And I'm very split on the extent to which it's a failure of the, scientific community. I'm very convinced that it is driven by a failure of public authorities to deliver on health services, for example. So you end up distrusting the medical community's advice because the healthcare system, which is quite distinctive from the medical professionals, has very large issues in Romania, for example. But once again, this is not just an issue for our side of the globe, as vulnerabilities existed in Western Europe and America as well. So because of your past experience, you alter your present attitudes and behavior. But coming back to the scientists themselves, with regards to vaccination, medical professionals have very accurately and generously used their time to present us with the proper arguments. So if we are to be looking for a culprit, I think it's the way we've left our societies get fragmented with regards to the connection between local communities, societal real-life bubbles, and these broader scientific communities who are active at national and international levels. So, and this is not linked to vaccination and medical science only. It's linked to climate science. It's linked to, digital technologies. It's linked to 5G networks and so on. So I think we really need to be very mindful of the educational channels, the societal mechanisms of connection. Not just information, but the quality of public service, the quality of education, the quality of the healthcare system, and how these are linked between the national and international levels where the scientists live and the local communities that are mostly affected by the current challenges.
Yes, very true. Ryan, Flavia, do you have additional comments on this? Anti-science feelings.
If I may, if Ryan doesn't mind, because I have a comment that is a continuation of what Clara said. We recently did a research on the predictors of a vaccine acceptance in Romania, a survey which we did together with Loredana and other colleagues, other researchers. And the main finding of our survey was that the most important, we tested some predictors that are related to the media ecosystem and that are related to trust and public opinion. And what results from our predictive model is that the most important factor that predicts the decision to vaccinate is trust in the people and in the agents, authorities, actors that manage the COVID-19 pandemic. In the case of Romania, at least, there is high distrust in the political establishment, high distrust in the central institutions, and I think this negatively reflected on the decision to vaccinate. So in Romania, at least, I think that the anti-science movement was first a movement against those who publicly endorse some findings and try to justify political measures regarding the pandemic with backing up with science. Sometimes the politicians misunderstood science. Sometimes they failed to clearly explain. Other times they used science as a scapegoat for unpopular decisions. And I think everything led to a generalized distrust and discontent regarding everything that was proposed for the managing of the COVID-19 pandemic, the vaccine included. And let's not forget that the anti-vaccination movement is not new, and it gained additional force and momentum in this case, but it's not a new phenomenon. I think it's a phenomenon that we failed to manage in a timely manner, and now we pay the price.
Building on this discussion that we're having about how matrix this problem is, I think in health especially, there is also a level of grift and sort of fraudulent behavior around the selling of false cures that builds on both the lack of trust and faith that people have, but also the absence of options and alternatives that many people have that lead them into wellness communities where they're seeking alternative solutions to problems that are largely ignored by the medical establishment. I think especially of the sort of well-documented research about women's health that leads many women into wellness communities to find solutions for problems that medical science doesn't care about in the ways that it cares about erectile dysfunction for men or something else like that. And there's been a lot of good research recently that shows that those communities have become fertile ground for targeted, fraudulent campaigns to drive people to buy false cures. And so there is a real sort of follow the money piece here to look at, where people are trying to profit from COVID as an opportunity and have been quite successful at it, I think. And what's different now, because as my colleagues have said, these kinds of things are not new, these kinds of campaigns. What's different now, though, is the person leading that campaign can be leading it from their basement. They can be buying Facebook ads by the penny that are highly targeted to these communities. They can have a YouTube channel with 1 million followers and be publishing daily. And so that idea of pouring gasoline on top of a problem that may have already existed is augmented by the hyper-connected, low-cost, highly targeted nature of the tools available to everyone. And so it used to be, I think, that propaganda was available, perhaps not exclusively, but more exclusively to the very high-reach institutions, mostly governments. But now, by virtue of these tools, propaganda is available to everyone, every day, all day, and almost in real time. And so I think there is a worsening of a problem that was always there. I mean, some of the things I'm talking about also existed in climate change, and we've seen recent conversations about the ways the large oil companies and those invested in the oil industry have used disinformation to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt, largely to drive profits of an industry that they know is dead and are just trying to keep it alive long enough to extract as much profit as they can before it's truly over. And so we've seen this before and for decades. And so I think one of the interesting questions is what's different, and then also what can we do about it? And I think there are things that are underway and have been promoted to try and give people better tools. There's a lot of good discussion about what's called pre-bunking, which is anticipating the messages that people will be shared and trying to equip them to be less receptive to them when they arrive. That's a lot of work for a society to do that. And so I think, and it's long, slow work, making people resilient to a campaign that won't happen before it happens is really, really tough work. And so I think I think we have a lot of work to do as a society and as communities, and it won't be solved in any one place.
So much, Ryan. And speaking about efforts, societal efforts that should be done in order to tackle disinformation, we have a very interesting comment and question at the same time from a member of our audience, Anne-Marie Blejan. Welcome, Anne-Marie, and thank you very much for your very insightful comment. First the comment as such, and afterwards the question. Leaving aside the assessment and the complex picture of the moment, I would turn the focus on solutions and ways to mitigate disinformation and the effects of fake news, now that we kind of know what we are confronted with. And the question is as follows. What can be done? Where can we should start to reduce the effects of these phenomena? So, of course, an open question for all of you. And I think that this question could also help us aggregate the conclusions and the main insights of this webinar. Clara, please.
I mean, if I may just turn gasoline upon our discussion, my solution would be to go offline. And why I say that? Because what starts online can be better tackled offline if we actually reach our vectors of trust in local communities. I know I'm kind of going back and back again to this idea of targeted action at local level, but we've found that during times of crisis, that in the pandemic's time, in the same country, in the same region, in the European Union, very, very, very different reactions and vulnerabilities and capabilities to manage the crisis were recorded at subnational level. So I think we should be very mindful of this fact and this growing division, not just within the members of our society, but within and across local communities. And I think the more we pay attention to not allowing, so I really liked Ryan's term of pre-bunking. I think we should be very careful not to allow for our communities to be clustered together in what will become dominant narratives in local communities. So if we are careful enough to propagate within different communities our messages and our verified information, we might penetrate areas that have previously been left aside.
I'll jump in quickly and give Flavia the last word. The Commission wrote a report on this topic, and which is probably why you invited me to speak. So I won't go through it, but I would encourage folks to read the 15 recommendations. But a couple of key highlights. One, we need a lot more transparency from the platforms, and we need a greater understanding of how they work. We need to understand what the platforms do to our communities and to ourselves in a sort of through the psychology and cognitive science of these interactions. We don't really understand how it works as well as we could in order to have effective countermeasures. We need to hold the worst actors accountable and create systems that do that, or everything from content moderation to addressing super spreaders and the worst actors. And we need to rebuild our infrastructure of trust, things like local news, things like safe and secure elections, and build the core infrastructure in place so that people can trust what they see in science, in elections, in public health, et cetera. I think lastly, we need to look to each other and think about the norms in our society that we want to operate under. It wasn't that long ago that when people were caught lying in public office, they resigned. And today, those officials have learned and frankly been allowed to stay in those places because the norms have shifted. We as a community are responsible for those norms, and we should think about the ways we want to behave, how we want to hold each other accountable in our communities. That's not about laws, that's actually about community and social connection. And so I think the report outlines all of these ideas and some more. I'd encourage folks to check it out and to see how it applies in your own world.
Flavia, the final word.
Thank you. I'm honored to have the final word. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Aspen Institute for this report on information disorder. I think the recommendations there are so on point I enjoyed them a lot. I would also like to draw attention to the fact that the European Union is very close to having the most complex and advanced regulation for the digital space in the world. It sounds a little bit cocky, I know, but it is the opinion of experts that study this legislation. I am referring to the Digital Services and the Digital Markets Act package. And anyone who is interested in knowing what are the measures that are being proposed can consult, including in Romanian language, can consult the proposals and step into the debate on this topic if they wish. It is too late to discuss these measures in detail, but just to invite the audience to read upon them.
Thank you all so much. Very interesting debate. I'm really looking forward to other pieces of information and to other new data, to very insightful comments and conclusions on this pandemic of disinformation. And now the final word of the moderator, such, which is not actually my final word, but it is extracted from the final report by the Commission on Information Disorder. It was very inspiring for me, and it says like this: information disorder is a crisis that exacerbates all other crises. When bad information becomes as prevalent, persuasive, and persistent as good information, it creates a chain reaction of harm. And if I may add here that sometimes it is up to us, up to each of us, to break this chain reaction of harm. And really, sometimes it is a matter of common sense or a very, very basic, logical, critical thinking that we should strive to promote and to apply in our everyday behavior, including sharing behavior, communication with our peers, and other similar behaviors. Thank you so much for your contributions, for your time, for your dedication, for your research on this, because I know that it is very time consuming and also it requires a lot of dedication. And again, looking forward to meeting you in future webinars and conversations on this topic. All the best.
Thank you so much.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you to
Bye.
the moderator and to the organizers, of course.
Yes, thank you. The team of organizers is really awesome and highly professional. Thank you for everything.